All right, good morning, everybody. We have about the same percentage of people in this class as I did in the last class. I know, everybody's in, not everybody, obviously, but lots and lots of people are in D.C. today. And I know they got there this morning because my daughter is on that trip, and she's never been to D.C. before. This is how libertarian my family is. I would never take my kids to that city. So anyway, she's very excited as she's driving around. She was taking pictures and sending us real time. Here's the Washington Monument here. Anyway, so they're there and they're safe, for those of you who may be wondering. But so actually I feel kind of bad. I've never taken my kids to I've taken them to Legoland and, but not DC. So.
Priorities.
The stuff that matters, right. Okay, so what we're going to do this morning, I want us to finish up, because we've spent 5 days, and actually it's even longer than I was kind of expecting. We spent 5 days talking about early colonial stuff, and I'm ready to be done. And you're probably ready to be done too. And there's so much more interesting stuff as we go along. But there are a couple of things I want to talk about this morning to finish us off. So I just looked up right now, right in between our two classes, that woman who's coming to speak is coming to your class. So at 11 next on Monday, so for your next class, we will have that guest speaker. So I would ask all of you guys, first of all, if you can look great like you normally do, and if you would sit up close, I would really appreciate it, so that the faculty who are coming in, because we'll have, I think, close to 13, 14 faculty will be in here. We may even need to go get some more seats, but they'll want to sit in the back and watch. And don't worry, they're not observing you. They're observing the woman who's here on the job prospectus, and treat her well. Obviously be kind to her. Don't take her down. Just let her do. Do your thing. Let her do her thing. Let it go naturally and organically, and it'll be fine. So I will be here, obviously, and I'll introduce her, and then at that point, she'll take the class over, and it'll be her class. And she is going to be speaking on the Great Awakening, on kind of the rise, which we'll talk just briefly about today, but on the rise of evangelicalism in the world, which takes place mostly in America and Britain in the 1700s, in the 18th century. So we'll come back to that in a bit. Okay, so where we ended, so everybody's okay on that. And I might send you guys an email to remind you that that's going to happen on Monday as well. But at this point, you all know. Okay, so when I left you guys on Wednesday, we were pretty much done talking about the Puritans. And I wanted to get to the Quakers, which we have not talked about in this class. And I'd like us for at least a bit to look, I think it's page 37, to turn to the document that we have from William Penn, and it is 37, but we'll actually start on 38, and look at his argument about what the nature of government should be. But I want to give you a little bit of background about who the Quakers are. So the Quakers, and we talked about the Puritans in New England, we've mentioned, but I hope you guys, some of you at least, have had a chance to read William Byrd's diary, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. In the middle, so we've got the Roundheads, and then we've got the Cavaliers, but in between, we've got a lot of middle-class normalcy as well. And for us, the Quakers really matter, not because of their theology, but because of what they create. And probably the greatest thing to come out of Quaker society is Philadelphia. Philadelphia, and I know now it's a pit, but it wasn't always a pit. It was a great, great city for a very long time in its history. And one of the reasons it was such a great city was because not only is it named after, it meant to be the city of brotherly love, but it's a great city because it really does represent in so many ways the kind of best of what an open America could look like. Now, it's not totally tolerant. There's still intolerances there. But when we compare it to other places in the world, it's got a lot of the humanity of, say, Paris without the crime. Or it has a lot of the commerce of London, but without the greed. So it's a city of moderation in a lot of ways, and it will be the major city for America up until probably the 1830s. New York will take a hold in the 1830s, and it will never give it up. But that doesn't happen until about the 1830s. So for really the first 100, 150, 200 years of American history, Philadelphia is our central city. It is the great city of Western civilization. And it's not an accident that the Declaration is written there and that the Constitution is written there and that our government meets there from time to time. Yet this is just, it's a great city in all kinds of ways. And it really is the greatest product of the Quakers. But the Quakers themselves, as a denomination, are very strange. They were formed only in 1647, so they're brand new compared to everything that we're talking about. You imagine 1649 is a key date in here for us because that's when Charles I is beheaded. And so you have this introduction, if you remember when we talked about English history, you have the introduction of a Cromwellian dictatorial republic. But just 2 years before that, you have the development of this new sect in England, right? S-E-C-T. You've got this denomination in England called the Friends. That's what they call themselves, the Society of Friends. Everybody else calls them Quakers to make fun of them, and there's a reason for that. But the Society of Friends is this very unusual denomination because among Christians, they generally don't think very highly of the Old Testament. So they don't look at the Old Testament and New Testament as parts of a whole, as most Christians would. They tend to look at the Old Testament and they see how wrathful and vengeful and violent and bloodthirsty God the Father is in that, and they reject it. They basically say, this cannot be the same God as we see in Jesus Christ. There's just too much of a difference here. So they reject the Old Testament for the most part, not completely. I don't want you to think that they just rule it out absolutely, but they put so much emphasis on the New Testament, it's almost as though that the Old Testament really no longer matters. And then they have this other unusual belief. And the other unusual belief is that there will not be a literal second coming of Christ. So they don't think in terms of a new Jerusalem. They don't think in terms of the heavenly city. What they argue is that the discussion of a second coming of Christ is a symbolic discussion. And that what happens, and this is where the quaking experience comes, what happens is that the Holy Spirit, which is really Jesus, turns on this inner light within you at some moment. And so all of your life, in a Quaker's understanding, is geared towards this moment where you have this quaking experience. Now that's the term they use, and it's why people call them Quakers to make fun of them. But you have this quaking experience, and it's this moment, this jarring moment in your life, and it could happen, you could be 7 or you could be 60. There's no formula for it. It's in God's time. But there will be a second coming of Christ in your soul. You, as a temple of the Holy Spirit, will be the temple of this second coming, and it will happen individually. So every person will experience it, but they will experience it at different times. And the problem with this is that most of us, being non-Quaker, most of us will have this experience and we'll have no idea what the heck just happened. And we'll miss it. We'll miss our moment to accept Christ into our hearts. And so the whole idea of Quakerism is that you educate people to get them ready for the quaking experience. And once God has chosen to turn your inner light on and you accept it, then he may speak to you more than once because Jesus is alive in your soul. Jesus is alive in you. So it's quite possible that it will happen again, but it only happens the one time for the initial one, the one that awakens us, that brings him to us. So what a lot of Quaker religious ceremony is just quiet. Quakers get together and they have what they call meetings. They don't have mass, they don't have service, they have meetings. And so they get together and they sit around, sometimes in a circle, sometimes like in a classroom like this. And you could have an hour or 2 long service where nobody says anything. Now, imagine any of you have ever been to a charismatic Pentecostal service where it's nonstop yelling and screaming and people speaking in tongues and loud music and bass guitar. The Quakers are the exact opposite. The Quakers just sit in quiet and they wait until someone is turned on by Christ, and then they might speak. They're motivated to speak. I feel the Lord has called me to read this passage from wherever, from Paul. And they read it, and that's it. That's what you do. And then you may have an intellectual response such as, thank you, Brother Theo, for reading that. I believe that Christ is telling me that we should. And it's just this totally staid, quiet conversation. So really the exact opposite of a Pentecostal meeting. I bring this up in part. I always find a little bit of humor in this. They're great. A lot of the Quakers were very interested in education. And there are a lot of great colleges in America that are based originally on the Quaker religion. They call themselves the Society of Friends. So where I grew up in Kansas, there was one in Wichita called Friends University. But one of the reasons that I always find them humorous is that the Quakers were often hired by the U.S. government to go evangelize, because they weren't too radical, to go evangelize to the American Indians. And you get someone like the Sioux, who are like the charismatics. If you're going to worship God, you need to be really loud about it. You need to be forceful. You got to jump around. You got to dance. You got to holler. And I love these images of these Quakers asking all of these American Indians to just sit around in a room quietly and nobody say anything. Right? This was just painful for the Indians. Yeah.
I worked with a Quaker this past
Oh,
summer,
that's great.
and he was describing a family wedding where they all just go and they kneel and they just sit there, and then that's the wedding.
This is the ultimate kind of stoic repose, right?
And they sit in like incremental circles of the people who are closest to the bride and groom, radiating outward.
Yeah, that's a Quaker wedding. Yeah, absolutely. That's great. So we still, they're around, but not a lot. There aren't a lot of Quakers around anymore, sadly, but they're an amazing people. And one of the things I will say about them that I absolutely admire, I mean, that's not my form of worship, but I absolutely admire them for, they had this idea that everything they did in life was a form of prayer. It's what a Catholic would call Opus Dei. Everything is the work of God. And so it didn't matter if you were raising crops, or you were butchering hogs, or you were in a good conversation with your neighbor, or you're building a building. Everything you do as a form of prayer, and therefore you have to do it with absolute excellence. So any of you who ever get a chance, if you get a chance to drive around in the countryside of Pennsylvania, don't take I-80, get off the road, off the interstate, and drive in the back country, and you'll see barns that are 400 years old that are still in perfect condition. They were made to last, and they're beautiful. And there is something just very telling, I think, about that Quaker ideal. Okay, so I'd like us, if you don't mind, let's look to 38, because on page 38, we have now William Penn, probably the most famous of Quakers. So he was there at the beginning of Quakerism. He's not the founder of it. The founder is a guy named George Fox. But here we have William Penn. And Penn is trying to describe, what do we need in government? What is a good government? And you'll see here, he's not exactly an Orthodox Quaker, because he also takes the Old Testament really seriously. So anybody want to volunteer to read this passage here? So read basically from when the great and wise God right down to the end on page 39, right before the quotes there, the inset quotes. Mary Kate, thank you.
When the great and wise God had made the world of all his creatures, it pleased him to choose man, deputy to rule it, and to fit him for so great a charge and trust. He did not only qualify him with skill and power, but with the integrity to use them justly. This native goodness was equally his honor and his happiness, and while he stood there, all went well. There was no need of coercive or compulsive means. This precept of divine love and truth in his bosom was the guide and keeper of his innocency. But lust, prevailing against duty, made a lamentable breach upon it, and the law that before had no power over him took place upon him, and his disobedient posterity, that such as would not live comfortable to the holy law within, should fall under the reproof and correction of the just law without, and a judicial administration. This the apostle teaches in diverse of his epistles. The law, says he, was added because of transgression. In another place, knowing that the law was not made for righteous man, but for this disobedient and ungodly, for sinners, for unholy and profane, for murderers, for whoremongers, for them that defile themselves with mankind, and for the manstealers, for liars, for perjured persons, etc. But this is not all. He opens and carries the matter of government a little further. Let every soul be subject to the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that are to be ordained of God, whoever therefore resists the power, resists the ordinance of God. The rulers are not a terror of good works, but to evil. Will you then be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and you shall receive the praise of the same. He is the minister of God to you for good. Wherefore you must needs be subject, not only for the wrath, but for conscience sake. This settles the divine right of government beyond exception, and that for two ends. First, to terrify evildoers. Secondly, to cherish those that do well, which gives government a life beyond corruption, and makes it as durable in the world as good men shall be. So that government seems to me a part of religion itself, a thing sacred in its institution and end. For if it does not directly remove the cause, it crushes the effects of evil, and as is such, though lower yet, an emanation of the same divine power that is both the author and subject of pure religion. The difference lying here, that the one is more free and mental, but the other more corporal and compulsive in its operations. But that is only to evildoers, government itself being otherwise as capable of kindness, goodness, and charity as a more private society. They weakly err that think there is no other use of government than correction, which is the coarsest part of it. The daily experience tells us that the care and regulation of many fail other offers, and more soft and daily necessary make up the greatest part of the government, and which must have followed of the peopling of the world. Adam never fell, and will continue among men on earth under the highest attainments they may arrive, by the coming of the blessed second Adam, the Lord from heaven. Thus much government in general as to its rise and end.
Great job, Mary Kate. Thank you for doing that. Okay, so let's think about this, which she just very nicely read. There is this moment here, and notice all the references that are specific are references to St. Paul, right? That emphasis on the New Testament. But here we have Penn not only promoting the New Testament, he does give us the God of the Old Testament, but notice how he does it. He does it by noting that God made us agents over the earth. So we go back to Genesis. God made us agents over the earth, and the first Adam was given the duty to name the creatures and to have stewardship over the earth. But now we get to the second Adam, and the second Adam is Christ, he who redeems all things. So we can't only think about the Old Testament here. We have to conclude it. We have to find its finish in the New Testament, according to Penn. And therefore, if we imagine how do we govern things, how do we maintain our agency in good, it's not enough merely to restrain evil. We must also promote the good. So what we find in a place like Philadelphia or in Pennsylvania with the Quakers is they're very interested in law, not merely as a means of restraining what's wrong. Think about the capital laws that we read briefly in here from Massachusetts, and you do this, you die. Well, Penn's saying the law has to be something more than that. It can't be just a terror to the evil. It also has to be a comfort to the good. And so we need the law to set an example. And one of the things that the Quakers really emphasize, and we can agree or disagree with this, though I'm rather taken with the argument, there can be no good government. And notice the argument here is called the frame of government. There can be no good government unless you have a majority of good men who are willing not only to be governed, but to govern. So morality is critically important to the effectiveness of a society. If we don't have moral men, meaning moral men and women, if we don't have a moral population, we're not going to have a stable population. we all expect that there will be ne'er-do-wells. There will always be evil. That, of course they're there. We're not fools. We know that they're there. But we can't focus only on them. We have to think about the good and how do we promote the good. So Penn is making the argument, and one that I think Americans generally have taken very seriously, but it's changed a lot with Trump. It's changed a lot in the last few years. But the argument was by most Americans, we have to have deeply moral leaders. If our leaders aren't moral, that signifies something about who and what we are as a people. And that's very different from the European model. European model, and not English, but the continent, where you can imagine in France, well, of course the prime minister is having an affair. All men have affairs. That's just the course of things. We often don't take it that way in America. We think that our leaders should be held to a higher standard. Now, we've become more cynical, and we've allowed more deviation among our leaders, at least openly, than we used to. But regardless, there is this foundational argument that there has to be a certain morality, and partly because we want the good to know that they too can thrive. We don't want the good to feel like they're fools, they're chumps, that everybody's taking advantage of them. We need them to know that they're making a difference and that they're not just tolerated as kind of fools. That becomes the argument for Penn. So notice how he puts it. It's not enough to focus on the first Adam, he who names and restrains and has stewardship. We have to focus on the second Adam, and that is he who redeems. So we have to be willing to put good forward and to be willing to defend it. So a very interesting argument, and an argument that at the time, even though it may seem a little old-fashioned now, at the time was incredibly advanced in terms of trying to understand how do we rule ourselves. Again, it's not just you've done wrong, we punish you, but we try to promote the good in some way. So in this way, the Puritans give us a different example of how to govern than what we've seen elsewhere. So we're trying to promote what's good, and out of that, we're going to get something like Philadelphia. So imagine, when we think about Philadelphia or we think about Pennsylvania in the 1700s, what we're coming to next week, who's the most famous citizen to come out of it? Who's the most famous person we identify with Pennsylvania after William Penn? Who's from Philly? Anybody want to throw out a name, even as a guess? Yeah, absolutely. Right? The key figure, Ben Franklin, who was regarded as a wizard in Europe because he captured lightning. Right? Only wizards can do that. I'm not exaggerating, but that's how they thought of him. It was probably more of a title than anything else. But Franklin was a demigod in his day, given all the things that he was able to innovate and make and understand. A true Renaissance figure in every way. And yet, he's not from Philadelphia. He's from Puritan society. He was born in Boston, and he got out of there as quickly as he could. He didn't want to live in a Puritan society. He wanted to live in a society where he could innovate a lot. And that meant if he's in America, he's in Philadelphia. If he's in Europe, he's in Paris. But if he's here, he's in Philadelphia. And that speaks very highly, I think, of what Pennsylvania was and the kind of toleration that it allowed. Now, it's still not completely tolerant. You still have to be Christian in Pennsylvania. They're not going to tolerate Jews. They're not going to tolerate atheists, even though Franklin is close. They're not going to tolerate that. But it's still more tolerant than most other places. So we can criticize it for its intolerance, but frankly, it was about the least intolerant place there was anywhere. So Philadelphia was a very open city relative to other cities at the time. So let's transition and let's look at this final group, the Virginians, for a moment. And I know I told you guys you didn't have to have your documents read yet until Monday, and that's totally fine if that's the case. But for those of you who've had a chance to read the Diary of William Byrd for this class, and I want to talk about it for a bit, what is it that we would understand from Byrd? So we've given you, it's an odd thing, we've given you this 1 month period out of his secret diary. So we start one day and we end the same day a month later. You get a kind of just a really small slice of this guy's life. These, by the way, these diaries weren't made public until about 100 years ago. So they just were discovered, and then they had to be, part of it was written in code. So the code had to be figured out and broken, and now we've got this guy's diaries. But I don't want anyone in here to think that he's writing to somebody other than himself. This is his record of what he's trying to do. And so we get a rare glimpse inside the very private life and very weird life of this guy. Very strange. But what do we know about him from what we've read here? So, yeah, Vika.
He's pretty systematic in his life. Like,
Talk about that for a moment.
Like, he always wakes up at like 7.
Okay.
He has a 50% chance of reading the Bible or not.
Okay.
And then he kind of reflects on that, and then he does his business, which is, I don't really understand what his business is.
Okay.
Text. And then he always ends, like most of the time he ends, even if it's a bad day, he ends with good thoughts, good health, good humor.
Yeah. So there's definitely a pattern. There's a ritual to his life. He's very ordered in everything that he does. So there's almost a clockwork precision in what he's doing here. What else do we notice about him then? That's a great start. So what else can we identify with him? What's he like as a person? Does he fit William Penn's description of a good leader? No, not at all. Right. Not at all. This is a guy who is constantly womanizing. Right? Think about how does he treat his wife? And this is why I suggested to you the other day that no matter how oppressive Puritan society is, my guess is that every woman in this room would rather live in New England than in Virginia. You know, here he is. He's a total elite. He may be in the top 10 men in command in Virginia. What role does his wife play in all of this? What is she for him? What does she serve for him? There's even a moment she has the flu and he doesn't care. Right? Yeah, Mary Kate.
On November 5th, he just talks right at the plus one. Like, I invited my wife and Mrs. Dunn to dinner for governor. So.
Yeah, so she's eye candy, basically. And what else? You're absolutely right. Anybody catch the euphemism here? What's he do all the time with her that he records? He Rogers her, right? This is a euphemism for he has sex. And sometimes he Rogers her vigorously, right? And and even the time that she was sick, he didn't care. He Rogered her. Right? So everything we really learn about her, she is merely a means to his pleasure in almost every way. And how she may be one of the 10 most powerful women in Virginia, but she has hardly any power because this is a patriarchy. It's only the men that count. And you can't even possibly imagine a Puritan woman for all the failings of Puritan society. You can't imagine even the most meek Puritan woman putting up with something like this. Right? This is a really interesting relationship. I don't think a healthy one in the least, but a really interesting relationship. Okay, what do we know about Byrd then as a thinker, besides the fact he's orderly, which he is? What does he know? How can we judge his education level? Yeah, go ahead, Vika. I'm sorry. Yes, Vika, go ahead.
He reads in Hebrew and Greek, so he seems like classically trained.
Okay, so we know he's fluent in Greek and Latin and Hebrew. So he's not only learned, which it would make sense that for any elite of the time they would be fluent in the classical languages, but to learn Hebrew is another step. And that was not expected in society. So to learn Hebrew means this is a self-starter. This is a guy he's working hard, he's very bright. There's another language he wants to learn. Did anyone catch this? There was only one mention of it. And I bring this up mostly because I love why he's trying to do this. He wants to learn Italian.
Yeah.
Why? Who would you read in Italian? Who? Dante, absolutely. Can you imagine? I mean, I would love to be that author, that people learn my language strictly because they want to read my book. Isn't that incredible? There's nothing else in Italian you're going to read. You're going to read Dante. So, again, this guy's brilliant. There's no question about that. He's liberally educated. He's brilliant. And yet, why can he be that way? What gives him the time? And I will get back to the question of what his business is. But what gives him the time to do this? What are we missing by looking at this guy and this guy alone in Virginia? Even if we took one diary of a Puritan woman or a Puritan man, we could pretty much say, because of the way the society works, this is representative of the society. How representative is Byrd of his society? Yeah, Pika, go ahead.
On a plantation.
Yeah. So what does that mean? Draw that out.
It means that there's slave labor that he doesn't really have
Yeah.
to do, handiwork.
Absolutely. So is this guy doing any work? He is almost certainly reading all the time. And he's reading probably the latest agricultural journals and news, and he's figuring out what do you do with the soil and the climate. And then he goes out and he tells his overseer, this is what we need to be doing. And then the overseer goes out and he makes 300 slaves do it. So when we're looking, and this is always jarring, when we look at someone like William Byrd, we're looking at the extreme elite of society, but the only way he can do what he does is by all the slave labor under him. So the vast majority of people in this society are not William Byrd. Byrd is an extreme example of the elite of the elite. And I'm not a Southerner, and I don't mean this just to denigrate Southerners, but I will never forget the experience the first time I went to Charleston, South Carolina, one of the most beautiful cities I have ever been to. And you can just walk around the neighborhoods in Battery Park and on the southern part of the city, and the architecture of each house is just stunning. You can stop in front of every house and be amazed. And then you get just to the north of Battery Park, and there are these really drab, low, utilitarian brick buildings, and they're the slave markets. And you realize, it's like, no matter how beautiful this was, it could only be beautiful because it was built on the backs of slavery. It's jarring. It is deeply, deeply disturbing to recognize that. And the same thing is true here. Imagine if he treats his wife this way, what he treats his slaves like. Right, so this is not a good guy at all. He's a pretty nasty guy in all kinds of ways. So anybody catch what is his business? What does he do? Does he even have a business? Doesn't he just kind of basically manage the managers of his plantation? That's kind of it. And then he runs gossip between the governor and other people who are elite within Virginia. So again, this is a radically different place than what we saw in Puritan New England in every way, right? Really different. This is the difference between a Roundhead society and a Cavalier society, and an extreme Cavalier society, right? There's one other aspect I want to talk about with Byrd that I think is very important, and that is, what is his faith life like? He tells us, right, he always is thankful, as you said, for several things in his life. But he often says, I apologize for not saying my prayers. What's he mean by that? Why would he write that down? And remember, this is not meant for anybody to read. This is for himself only. It is his secret diary. So what do you think he means by, I forgot to say my prayers? Why didn't he just say, Jesus, thanks for a great day. Sorry for all my thoughts and faults. Please make me better tomorrow. Good night. I mean, that most of us would be okay with that. What's different for him? And you've got to kind of take a guess here. Anybody? Vera, do you want to try again? Or Vika, do you want to try again?
at the end seemed very like rote.
Okay.
But there's also, because he's of the elite, it seems like that prayer in the synagogue of that one Jewish man that was like, "Thank you that I am not like the other men." And it's like thankful, but not. There's not really like a.
It's a great insight. Yeah. Okay. So let's admit for a moment that his prayers are by rote. Why would that be the case? What religion would he be? It's Church of England. He's a Cavalier. And he's high church. And so how long would it take for him, if he were to say his prayers properly, how long might it take? Probably take like 45 minutes to an hour. Right? This is where next week's going to really matter for us. There is no evangelicalism yet. There's no casualness of giving Jesus a high five and thanking him for things. Right? We're not at that stage. Jesus, imagine how formal this guy is when he goes to the governor. And Jesus is the governor of the universe. So you don't just approach Jesus with a quip and a joke and a thank you. It has to be deeply, deeply thought out. And I understand that we in 2020 might think it's rote. And I think that's a very fine way of putting it and an accurate way of putting it. For him, it would be accurate. It would be sensible in the way that he's trying to present it. So someone else has already told me, how do I approach God? Well, they've written out all these prayers that people over time have accepted, and therefore this is the proper way. In the same way that when I approach the governor, I only behave in a certain way possible. I only do this, and I never do anything else. Otherwise, I'm not only denigrating myself, I'm denigrating Jesus. So he's going to have a very formal outlook. And that means one last thing that I think is important about this diary. He's writing it as a secret diary. Who else does he intend to read it beside himself in the big scheme of things? This is for God. And there's a confessional quality to it. It's almost as though he stepped into the confessional and he's saying, I blew it. So I don't want us to walk away thinking this guy is just a totally decrepit, corrupt guy. He is. He's bad. But there's also an element of redemption in the story that he's trying to tell, because he's trying to get this out and maybe make it better. So it is a secret diary, but God knows. Right? And that is partly a confessional too. Okay, yeah.
I was kind of trying to work this out.
Sure.
And maybe you've got further insight about it, but it looks like his sister is sort of like her line incidentally gets crossed with Robert E. Lee's down the way. Because Lee married Marianna Randolph Custis.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
Okay, so is that the case? Or
Yes.
Is that just,
Yes, and the Byrds are still the most prominent family in Virginia to this day. It was Robert Byrd was senator, who was the great-great-great-great-grandson. He was senator for something like 40 years, and he died about 20 years ago. So yeah, this is the family.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And they're intermarried with the Lees and the Custises and the Washingtons. And yeah, absolutely. So, yeah. No, I'm glad you caught that. Yeah.
So, in the first entry from the first,
Sure.
He says that he wrote in his journal for an hour. Does he have a different journal, like a journal that's not this? Or would he just not write in it for a few days and then write a bunch of entries?
Right, that's what he would do.
Okay.
Yeah, so he'd catch up. And this is multiple volumes. We only gave you 1 month out of years of this guy's diary. I mean, he never stopped writing. And it's it's this incredible insight. But can you imagine? I mean, in his own day and age, he was seen as a pretty good guy. Now we know all this stuff about him. And for it to come out like this is pretty amazing. I mean, for his family as well as for this guy and his reputation. Nobody can ever look at Virginia the same after this. It's like, wow, this is what's really going on behind the scenes. So it is a real revelation. So we actually gave you, so we put this, as you guys know, we put this book together. We gave you the most PG rated of the months. Yeah, so there's a lot going on. And I don't know if you caught, I mean, when he's going into town, he's having affairs. So it's not just his wife. I mean, he's meeting people, and there's a lot. This guy's got a lot of energy in all kinds of ways. So, yeah, not always put in the best way, but there's a lot going on here. So, okay, good. Well, I've only got one other thing I want to talk to you guys about today, and I want to talk just briefly then, not about William Byrd, but about one last colony that we have not given you the story of, and I want to tell you the story because I think it's going to be really important just to get the sense of how we're going to think about the Revolution and the last part of the colonial period. So next week, we're going to, remember you've got this guest speaker, but we're really going to be looking at two things that happened in America in the 1700s and the 18th century. We're going to look at the rise of evangelicalism. That's what your guest speaker is going to do, this job candidate, on Monday. But we're also going to look at what's called the Enlightenment. And these are two kind of radically different things. One which is incredibly pro-Christian and pro-scriptural, and the other which is a much more scientific, let's explore all these different things and find out what the universe is. It's much more related to the Renaissance than it is to traditional Christianity. But the last thing I want to mention in our discussion of the colonial world and the early colonial world is the one colony that actually did attempt to have radical toleration in terms of religion, and this is Maryland. So Maryland, of all the colonies, in its culture, its climate, it's going to be very similar to Virginia. Obviously, the two are next to each other, and so there's going to be a lot of commonality, the same kind of crops, same kind of economy. But the difference is when Maryland is founded as a sanctuary for Roman Catholics. And there are still a lot of Roman Catholic aristocrats who are secretly Roman Catholic in England. And one of the reasons to make a colony for them is not so we can make sure the Catholics have something. It wasn't let's throw them a bone. It was let's get them the heck out of England so they're not messing around with us. We don't want a subversive population in England. We'll send them over to Maryland. But what that means is that when these families come to Maryland that are Catholic, they generally are these aristocratic families. So we're only talking about a few, and they bring with them their households. So for maybe every 10 Catholics who come over, they're bringing over 300 Protestants. So we often think of this as a Catholic colony because there are Catholics in the group, but even then, and even when they're in charge, they're an extreme minority within Maryland itself. But the most interesting thing, and we don't have to get into Catholicism itself, but the most interesting thing about these group of people who settle in Maryland is that they decide upon creating complete religious toleration within the colony of Maryland. And they implement this kind of famous year for us in this class. They implement the law of toleration in 1649. And I always like to think about how weird that is. At the exact same moment that the English are murdering their king, beheading Charles I, and establishing a Puritan dictatorship, these guys in Maryland are proclaiming complete religious toleration. You can even be an atheist and live in Maryland, and that's wild for the time period, that you could be that extreme, that much on the outs. But here's the trade-off. And please know I tell you this just purely as information, not to pass judgment, but I think for any of us, it's an amazing question to ask. The trade-off is this. We'll give you total freedom of religion, but the only way we can guarantee that is if we put speech codes on what you say. So we're going to restrict what you can speak about in public, and they pass a speech code that has 3 prohibitions in it. And by the way, I also want you guys to know, and I've done some good academic work on this. Well, I should say I've done some academic work on it. Whether it's good or not, it's a different question. But I've done some academic work on this. And as far as I know, this is the first law of open toleration ever in the history of the world to be this open. I have not found a different place or a different time that is this open. But remember, you've got these restrictions. So the 3 restrictions. Number 1, in public, you may never, ever blaspheme God or talk about God in a denigrating fashion. Now, you can say what you want in your own home, but you can't at the marketplace or in the streets or in the classroom, anytime you're with someone beyond family, you are not allowed to speak illy in an ill fashion about God. Number 2, and here you see their Catholicism. You may never, ever speak ill about Mary, Jesus' mother, or about any of the 12 apostles except for Judas. You can mock him all you want, but you can't make fun of the other 12, right? The other 11 plus the new one, or Mary. So that's the second restriction. But the third restriction is fascinating. And this is where, we really have to put ourselves in a different time period. So, for those of you who know the church, and you guys are far enough along in college, you would know the different churches in town. If I said, what do you generally call yourself if you go to St. Paul's here in town? What would you proudly say? Of course, I'm a, what? Anybody know what St. Paul's is in town? Mary Kate.
Isn't it? Oh gosh.
That's okay.
I go.
Put you on the spot. Lutheran.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no, it's Lutheran, but
Yeah.
it's,
And that's what
Protestant.
that's all I'm looking for.
Oh,
It's just
sorry.
Lutheran, right?
Wow.
So no problem saying that. Well, at the time that this was written, if I called somebody a Lutheran, that's making fun of them because I'm saying they're not really Christian. They're a follower of this man, Martin Luther. So you cannot, in this third thing, you cannot denominate somebody. You can't limit them to the teachings of some idea beyond Christ. So I'm going to just read to you how this is written. You may not, upon any occasion, give offense or be reproachful in any manner whatsoever by declaring, calling, or denominating any person or persons whatsoever residing, traversing, trafficking, trading, or commercing within this province or within any of its ports, harbors, creeks, or havens. Now, just imagine that. We're not just talking about people who live in Maryland. We're talking about people who are on Maryland soil. So this applies to everybody. What can you not say? You may not call someone a heretic, a schismatic, an idolater, a Puritan, a Presbyterian, an independent, a popish priest, a Jesuit papist, a Jesuit popish priest, a Lutheran, a Calvinist, an Anabaptist, a Brownist, an Antinomian, a Barrowist, a Roundhead, a Separatist, or any other name that is meant to mock their religious belief. Now that's incredible when you think about this. So we can have complete religious freedom, but we get away with it by making sure you never talk about it in public. Now, my own preference is we go to the founding where you can have both. But I still want you to understand this is an incredible moment in the history of religious liberty in the way that they're trying to work this out. Now, crazily enough, this all goes to hell because in 1689, there's a coup in Maryland and a group of anti-Catholics take over the government there and they then implement the most anti-Catholic laws ever imaginable. It's insane what they do. And they get away with it up until the American Revolution. So basically, they've got 100 years where they get away with this. So Maryland goes from the most open to the least open within a few days in 1689. But it's an amazing attempt. Okay, any final thoughts or comments, guys? I'm taking you, we've got 5 seconds left. So, all right, thanks, everybody. Great class. And I will see you on Monday, so have a very good weekend. And just make sure you've got all those readings done and be prepared for class on Monday. And do sit up as close as you can to the front.